Well, there is much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. Pieter Cleppe heads the Brussels office for the British Policy Centre, Open Europe. Ali Alfoneh is a senior fellow at the Arab Gulf States Institute right here in Washington, D.C. With us from Minneapolis is Mark Fitzpatrick. He served in the U.S. Foreign Service for more than 2 decades and is currently an associate fellow at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. And joining us from Tehran is journalist and political commentator Ghanbar Naderi. Thank you to all of you for being with us. Ghanbar Naderi, let me start with you. According to results we have from the Iranian Interior Ministry, 219 of the 290-seat parliament went to conservatives. What do you make of this? This seems to be a major shift in Iranian politics. It seems now that the clerical leadership and the political leadership come from the conservative side.
Well, it looks like this was intentional when it comes to disqualification of a large number of reformist candidates this time around. But it's not the end of it. We know that the public participation was much, much lower than any other election in Iran over the past 40 years. And this year obviously was not an election year for the establishment. So yes, the conservatives won big time, but that's because there were no reformists to challenge them or compete against them. But let's not forget the fact that people are also disillusioned. This is a divided nation. At the same time, we had the problem of coronavirus, and of course the shooting down of the Ukrainian airplane, and the fact that officials lied to us. That's why people prefer to stay at home and not vote, many of them.
So what does this mean for Iran in terms of its relationship with the United States going forward? Do you see that relationship worsening now?
Well, it couldn't be worse than what it is now. I think what the conservatives are trying to do is to have a parliament that is in line with the next president, who is going to be, by the way, a conservative president. Then they want to call the shots with regard to talking to the United States. Make no mistake, this country cannot just go on forever like this. We need to talk to the United States government in order to get the sanctions lifted against us, and that is going to happen. But the conservatives want to have the final say in this, and not the reformists. That's why we are going to have a conservative parliament, and of course we are going to have a conservative president next year.
Ali Alfoneh, turnout, as Ghanbar Naderi just pointed out, was very low. Less than half of eligible voters went to the polls. Some say it was fears over coronavirus. Others say it was apathy, dissatisfaction with the country's clerical rulers. We have to remember that 7,000 candidates were disqualified by the Iranian Guardian Council. What do you make of the outcome?
Well, Mr. Khamenei wanted to have a more cohesive composition of the political elites of Iran, and he also wanted to have discipline within the parliament because the system is under pressure from the United States, but also from domestic issues. Any moment there could be protests again in the streets of Tehran and other major cities because of the economic problems that the public is experiencing. Under these circumstances, Mr. Khamenei probably thought that he really needed to discipline the party and to have a cohesive system. But of course, the regime as a whole is going to pay a price for this system, which is less representative. That means that people who have loyally served the Islamic Republic for the past 40 years have been disqualified, and they may, in the longer term, become oppositional figures themselves.
When you say that the Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei wanted discipline and he wanted cohesion, to what end?
In order to better manage the multiple crises that Iran is facing, the crisis in relations with the United States and the crisis of chronic public dissatisfaction with the performance of the regime. Last year in November, we saw bread riots in the streets of Iran, and at the same time, we have a different upper middle class rebellion against the system in the case of the shooting down of the Ukrainian airliner. So we have two groups, those who want bread and those who want freedom. And both groups are unhappy with the performance of the regime.
All right, let's go to Pieter Cleppe in Brussels. Peter, Europe seems to be in the middle of this. On the one hand, it wants some kind of a relationship with Iran. It also is trying very hard to salvage that nuclear deal. On the other hand, it's taking its cue from Washington, which seems to be holding most of the cards right now. How will Europe see the outcome of this election?
Well, the EU has tried to continue trade with Iran. It has created a so-called special purpose vehicle to allow European companies to trade with Iran and ignore the US sanctions. But basically these European companies have decided that they obviously do not want to risk access to the American market, which is much more important than the Iranian market. So I think the EU leadership knows that the Iran deal is dead. It may actually be a bit more dead if Trump will decide to end certain waivers, and some people in Congress, some hawks, are pushing for that. Now, I think ultimately going forward, to be fair to Trump, he wants to sit at the table with the Iranian leadership, and the Iranian leadership, the regime, refuses to sit at the table. So I think both sides probably have to give. I mean, the policy of sanctions has not been successful so far, just like in Cuba and Venezuela and many other cases. Sanctions have not delivered any results. On the contrary, it sort of helps the regime. As my predecessor pointed out, there have been protests, but not really because of the sanctions, but because of things like this mistake of shooting down a civilian airline. So, I mean, ultimately, I think Trump should hold back a bit. He should give it some time, and then ultimately, it's in both sides' interest to find some new kind of arrangement.
Peter, can Europe now play a role as honest broker? As we've just heard, the Iranians will now speak with one voice. As I pointed out, the clerical leadership and the political leadership are on the same side. They are in agreement with each other. And on the other side, of course, you have the United States under President Trump. So can Europe play a role as mediator?
I do think so. Of course, militarily, Europe has limited means, and European countries, but diplomatically, for example, the EU could declare the truth, which is that this Iranian deal is dead. And it could, for example, urge the Iranian leadership to sit at the table and to urge the United States not to go further with these sanctions, at least not to make them even more stringent, because, of course, typically they hit the civilian population, like which has always been the case with economic sanctions. I think if the EU would say, look, we give up on this deal, I mean, let's just be honest, I do think that could help convince some in Tehran that perhaps going back to the negotiating table is the way forward.
All right, let's bring in Mark Fitzpatrick from Minneapolis. Mark, the election's taking place. We know the result. Mostly conservatives now in Parliament. How does the U.S. respond to this?
Well, the United States government feels a sense of I told you so, that they've always been saying that the Iranian system is corrupt, hopelessly undemocratic, and the way that it played out with so many incumbent parliamentarians being disqualified by some unelected body. Iran is its own worst enemy in terms of portraying itself as undemocratic, even though in many ways it's more democratic than many of its neighbors. But the United States will continue to pressure Iran in ways that hurt every day the Iranian public. I would take issue with your guest in Europe saying that the United States could not, maybe it could compromise by not putting on more pressure. If there's going to be any compromise, the United States is going to have to loosen the pressure. That's the only basis for a renegotiated deal, or better, keeping the JCPOA and building on it. The United States loosening some sanctions and Iran returning to the limits, and then changing the deal timeline to make it last longer. Both sides are going to need to compromise if this issue is going to be kept under wraps.
Mark, just one point. When you said that there will be those in the United States who say, look, I told you so, wouldn't there also be those in Iran on the conservative side who will also say, I told you so, you wanted to go ahead, and this is being addressed to the reformists in Iran, saying you wanted to go ahead and sign a deal with the United States, which unilaterally violated that deal. They can't be trusted.
Oh, you're absolutely right. Absolutely. And they've been saying that. Ever since Trump was elected, because from the very beginning he said he wanted to rip up the deal, and then he sought to do that a year ago, and certainly the conservatives said that to Rouhani, and that's you know, that's part of the milieu in Iran right now, why moderates have you know, been rejected, although the real reason they've been rejected is because they weren't allowed to run in the first place. So, right, what you have is hardliners on both sides in Washington and Tehran saying, I told you so, refusing to really negotiate. You know, President Macron of France almost got the two sides together last September and would have, except that Trump refused to say in advance that he would loosen sanctions. So they came so close, and I feel sorry for Macron that he couldn't pull it together. I think there's still a possibility, though, in the coming months and in years, actually, depending on who is in the White House next year, to resume negotiations in a way that could be a win-win.
Ghanbar Naderi, is there the political will in Iran right now for these compromises to be made, for this deal to be renegotiated?
No doubt about it. Iran has never, rejected the idea of talks with the United States. The only catch here is that Iran says it has to happen within the framework of the JCPOA, and of course, it should be at the same negotiating tables that Iran signed that deal back in 2015, which means P5+1. This deal was not just between Iran and the United States. This was an international agreement that was ratified and endorsed by the UN Security Council. So if there is going to be any kind of negotiations, that has to happen among all P5+1 signatories to the deal, including the United States. Iran has never, ever said that we don't want to talk to the United States. Of course, the US government cannot be trusted, but the whole idea behind having a conservative parliament and president is that they want to have this kind of, as your distinguished guests made it absolutely clear, a cohesive government here that is going to speak in one voice with the United States government. So if something happens, they want to take the credit for it, and not just the reformists.
One other point, Ghanbar, you have conservatives in power now in Iran, but we've seen over the past year that there have been street protests. The Iranian people have taken to the streets to protest against the government. Could we see more of that ahead?
As I told you, this is a disillusioned nation now, not just divided. Anything could happen. Everybody is upset here because we lost the opportunity to talk to the United States and normalize ties. The officials here made the stupid mistake of lying to the people after shooting down that the Ukrainian airliner. And at the same time, the sanctions regime is still there. People are paying a heavy price. The US lies to us when it says that it is only going to target the US government and the establishment. No, that is not the case. There is a simple reason why many people didn't vote this time. Because they are suffering under the sanctions regime. They want the sanctions to be lifted. And for that to happen, they want the next conservative government to do just that. If not, I'm afraid we will see more protests on the streets. No doubt about it. It's not a matter of if, but when.
Ali Alfoneh?
Well, I slightly disagree with Mr. Ghanbar in Tehran. I think the reason why we saw the lowest level of participation in the election was because the Islamic Republic had introduced the highest level of disqualification of candidates. And it's perfectly normal, and we have seen it in the history of the Islamic Republic for the past 41 years, that whenever the Guardian Council disqualifies a higher number of candidates, we end up seeing lower level of participation. So that is the point where I slightly disagree with Mr. Ghanbari. But the fundamental problem is much bigger than this. And it is that no one knows the purpose of the Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign. We do not know if the Islamic Republic should should change its behavior, or Washington actually wants to change the regime in Tehran. Right. And that is the question that Tehran is also struggling with. And here in Washington, if you ask 5 different government officials what the purpose of the policy is, they give you 5 different answers. And this is the fundamental issue between the two countries that we are trying to find out about.
Mark Fitzpatrick, isn't that the problem, that we have Secretary of State Mike Pompeo say that these elections were a sham? All very well to use that kind of rhetoric, but there's no comprehensive, well thought out policy here in terms of how this relationship goes forward and what the end goals should be.
Oh, I think you're absolutely right, and your guest in Washington, Alfoneh, put it very well, that you hear different explanations from different parts of the government. I think the explanation that makes the most sense, I don't like it, but is just simply these sanctions are designed to weaken Iran, which is seen as an adversary and a potential future foe in a conflict. And so weakening Iran's economy and hoping to drive divisions among the populace is to America's longer-term advantage. I think that's the real reason, frankly.
Pieter Cleppe, are these elections going to be framed as a repudiation of President Rouhani? I mean, who do the Europeans deal with now? Can they play a role in easing sanctions?
Oh, I think everybody in Europe considers these elections to be a sham. They would not openly say it, perhaps in the same way as Mr. Pompeo. I think Europe is very much looking for any opportunity to continue or to relaunch a trade relationship with Iran. I think Europe will play along if the US makes a move by perhaps relaxing sanctions. That could be a worldwide concession, because these sanctions mainly hit civilians in return for the Iranian leadership going to the negotiating table. Now, I do think that people in Europe and outside of Europe need to give a bit more credit to the opponents of the Iran deal. I mean, there are some serious indications that this deal allows Iran to, let's say, move much closer to a nuclear weapon than would have been the case without the deal. And specifically for Israel, which is the only democracy in the Middle East, this is quite a concern. Now, if Iran is indeed so genuine about not wanting a nuclear weapon, it could simply accept more restrictions on nuclear enrichment. And regardless of the nuclear issue, there's the issue that the deal says nothing about long-haul ballistic missiles, which are actually not a concern for Israel, because Israel can already be hit by Iran anyway, but are a concern for Europe. So it's in the European interest to also reconsider this deal and to improve it. And I do think, looking at President Trump, how he has dealt in the past with deals, I think he's open to renegotiate deals, to negotiate something that is actually not all that far off from what pre-existed. So I would imagine he's willing to do that here. I think he's intelligent enough to know that unfortunately the regime is very strong in Iran, so that's why it may be better to basically have an arrangement of some kind with guarantees for security for everybody.
Okay. Mark, this is a debate that's been going on ever since President Trump withdrew from that nuclear deal, and that is it better to have a nuclear deal, albeit flawed, or no deal at all?
Yeah, I would take issue with the analysis by the last guest. You can't compare the deal with some ideal unicorn solution under which Iran would give up its nuclear program. You have to compare the deal with the situation that was at play when the negotiations started in 2003, when Iran was very close to having a breakout capability. And the deal walked that back greatly. 98% of its centrifuges destroyed, and more intrusive inspections. Now, Iran is breaking a lot of the limits, although the inspections remain in place, and that is crucial. So the deal is not dead, but most of the limits have been abrogated, and the trick is to keep Iran from abrogating them further. But Iran today is much further from a nuclear weapon than it had been in 2013, and that it would have been had there been no deal. Certainly the deal can be improved, lengthen the sunset clause. The missiles are an important issue, although currently Iran has no missiles that can hit Central Europe, just some missiles that can hit Greece and Southeast Europe. And trying to keep Iran where it is in terms of its missiles would be a very good objective, and the Europeans certainly would like to do that. So yes, it can be improved, but don't throw away the baby with the bathwater.
Right. Peter, a very quick response from you.
Well, I think I largely agree with that. Now we are where we are, and President Trump has actually taken certain actions. So I think that analysis of the previous guest was perhaps valid before Trump came to power. He has done what he has done. I think the way forward now is to use the sanctions as leverage to improve the deal. The US could make a move by relaxing them, and Iran could make a move by going to the table. And both on the ballistic missiles and the nuclear enrichment, both sides could find themselves to improve the deal.
Ghanbar Naderi, let's talk about something else, and that's the Iranian economy. It shrunk by 4.6% during the 2018-2019 fiscal year. We've also had oil sales that have been hit, and foreign reserves in the country have been dropping as well. Could that perhaps focus the minds of Iranian leaders and act as a big motivating factor to get talks back on track with the United States?
Well, this is as bad as it gets. I mean, look at the coronavirus, look at the way we have been isolated, the economic sanctions, the restrictions, and the inability of the remaining signatories to the nuclear deal to help Iran see the economic benefits of that important historic agreement. So, I mean, Iran has been pushed into a corner. It has no choice but to talk to the United States government. I told you before, I tell you again, Iran wants to talk to the United States government. It will definitely talk to the US government, but that will happen within the framework of the JCPOA and the P5+1. If that happens, Iran wants to see some economic benefits. If that happens, Iran is not going to threaten the United States government's military forces in the region or its neighbors. At the same time, Iran is going to put a cap on its nuclear program and energy production activities. By the way, Iran is not looking for nuclear weapons. Iran doesn't need nuclear weapons.
Ali?
Well, yes. So if the purpose of the maximum pressure campaign was to change the behavior of the regime, it has already achieved its goal. But unfortunately, it has changed the regime's behavior for the worse, not for the better. What we have seen is Tehran pursuing a dual path. On the one hand, the Islamic Republic desires to engage in negotiations with the United States and others, but at the same time, Iran is engaging acts of sabotage against shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, and it's also staged attacks against oil facilities and infrastructure in Saudi Arabia. So these two parallel tracks will continue as long as the maximum pressure campaign continues. And the reasons for this are very, very simple. Iran is step by step getting close to financial and economic collapse. Next year's budget is $39 billion. Out of the $39 billion, $13 billion are secured through tax revenue, $1 billion from other sources of income, and the rest had to be financed through oil and gas exports, which are not possible because of the sanctions regime. Iran may be capable of exporting and selling in the black market around $5 billion worth of oil, but that leaves behind a gap which is almost $20 billion just in next year's budget alone. And this is why we will see Iran intensifying both the diplomatic approach, but unfortunately also regional adventurism, because if there is no pressure, they do not believe that diplomacy will work.
And that's where we are going to have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching. Hello everybody, I'm Anand Naidu. If you enjoy the thoughtful, engaged discussions you see on The Heat, you may also want to subscribe to our podcast. It's appropriately titled The Heat. Twice a week we take a deep dive on world headlines, talking to experts, journalists and others. It's a fresh, focused and intimate look at the issues that matter most. Whether it's the Hong Kong riots, the latest Middle East conflict or US politics, The Heat podcast gives the clear context needed to understand both what's going on and why. And what's best, we come to you. Whether you're at home or on the go, you can find The Heat podcast just about anywhere podcasts are found. Just search The Heat CGTN. Have a listen today and subscribe. Thanks.